I buried my wife on a Thursday, and I came home from the funeral luncheon that same afternoon to find my son changing the locks on my front door. I want you to picture it, because I'll be seeing it for the rest of my life. A gray, cold October afternoon in Duluth, Minnesota. 62 years old, still in the only suit I own, the taste of church coffee still in my mouth, my wife of 31 years 4 hours in the ground, and there were boxes on the front lawn, in the drizzle, boxes of my clothes, my tools, and Colleen's things, her sweaters, her books, the quilt her mother made, sitting out on the wet grass like garbage set out for the truck. My son Shane was kneeling at the front door with a drill in his hand, putting in a new deadbolt. His wife Amber was standing on the porch with her arms crossed, watching me come up the walk. I said, "Shane, what in God's name are you doing?" And he stood up, and he looked at me, and he said the words I did not know a person could say to the man who raised him. He said, "This was my mother's house, not yours. You married in, Carl. You're not my real father, and now that she's gone, you've got no right to be here. So take your boxes and go." He called me Carl. He had called me Dad since he was 5 years old, and standing there on that porch 4 hours after we put his mother in the ground, he called me Carl. I stood on the walk in the rain and I did not yell. I looked at that boy's face, and I looked at my dead wife's sweaters on the wet grass, and I felt something in me go very still, and very cold, and very clear, because Shane, in all his anger and all his greed, had forgotten three things that were going to cost him everything he was reaching for. He forgot that the house was mine, not his mother's, mine. He forgot that 30 years ago, when he was 6 years old, I signed a paper in a courthouse that made me his father, in the eyes of the law, forever, and that paper does not tear up. And he forgot that I had already left him half of everything I owned. If you're new here, stay with me, because this one is about what the word family actually means, and it does not end where you think. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed, do it now, because you are going to want to see the last 5 minutes. My name is Carl Denning. I'm 62 years old, and for 34 years, I carried the mail in West Duluth, Minnesota. Same route, more or less, for 3 decades. Rain, snow, 40 below with the wind coming off Lake Superior. You walk it anyway. I knew every porch, and every dog, and every kid on that route. People say a mailman's job is nothing anymore, and maybe they're right, but I was proud of it. I never missed a day I wasn't sick, and I retired 2 years ago with a decent pension and a bad knee and the respect of about 400 families who knew Carl always came. I met Colleen in 1991. She was a widow with 2 little ones, Bridget, who was 5, and Shane, who was 3. Their father had died in a mill accident when Shane was a baby, and Colleen was raising those 2 kids alone on what she made in the cafeteria at Denfeld High School. I fell in love with all 3 of them at the same time. That's the truth. I married Colleen in 1992, and I did not marry her children as an obligation. I chose them. I coached Shane's baseball teams at the field on Grand Avenue. I taught Bridget to ride a bike on Ramsey Street. I was up at night with their fevers, and I was at every conference, and every concert, and every game. And in 1994, when Bridget was 8 and Shane was 6, I did something I have never once regretted until this year. I legally adopted them both. I sat in a courtroom in the St. Louis County Courthouse, and a judge asked me if I understood that this made me their father in every legal way, permanently, and I said yes, and I meant it more than I have ever meant anything in my life. They became Bridget Denning and Shane Denning that day. My kids. Not my stepkids. My kids. I never used that other word. Not once in 30 years. Colleen and I bought the house on Ramsey Street in 1998. We bought it together, the two of us, as joint owners, which is going to matter more than anything else in this story. We raised those two children in it. We paid it off. It was the only house Shane ever really remembered. Colleen got sick in the summer of last year. Breast cancer. And it was a hard 14 months. And I want to tell you who was there and who wasn't, because it explains everything. Bridget was there. My Bridget. She's a nurse at Essentia now, 38 years old, 2 kids of her own. She was there every week, driving up from Cloquet, sitting with her mother, helping me with the medicines and the appointments. Shane was not there. Shane came by maybe 4 times in 14 months. He was busy, he said. He and Amber had a business, a vape shop out in the mall that was hemorrhaging money, and they had their own house in Hermantown they couldn't afford, and they were drowning, and they did not have time for a dying woman who happened to be his mother. But here's the thing I didn't know at the time. While his mother was dying, Shane was doing math. He was looking at that paid-off house on Ramsey Street, and the retirement account I'd built over 34 years, and he was counting. Colleen died on the 14th of October. She held my hand and Bridget's hand, and she was not afraid. And then she was gone, and the whole world went quiet. And 4 days later, I buried her. And I came home to boxes on the lawn. If you have ever loved a child who wasn't yours by blood, and had somebody throw that in your face, type the word family in the comments. I read every single one. And stay with me, because what my son had already done down at the bank was so much worse than changing a lock. I did not sleep at that house that night. I couldn't get in it, for one thing. I drove to Bridget's in Cloquet, and I sat at her kitchen table, 62 years old, and I put my head in my hands, and my daughter, Colleen's daughter, my daughter, put her arms around me, and she told me she'd been afraid this was coming. She said that about a month before her mother died, Shane had called her, and he'd said, and I want to give you his exact words, the way Bridget gave them to me. He'd said, "When Mom goes, we need to make sure Carl doesn't end up with the house and the money. He's not even our real dad. That should be ours. Ours. Not Bridget's." She made that clear. She wanted no part of it. Shane's. Shane and Amber's, and their debt, and their failing vape shop. Bridget had told him to go to hell. And then she'd been sick about it for a month, not knowing whether to tell me while her mother was still alive, not wanting to put that on me on top of everything. So the next morning, instead of going back to Ramsey Street and standing on my own lawn begging my son to let me into my own house, I did something a lifetime of walking a mail route in bad weather teaches you. I stopped reacting, and I started thinking, and I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a lawyer in Duluth named Karen Lindgren, who does property and estates, and who I picked because a woman at Bridget's church said she was tough and she didn't lose. I sat in Karen Lindgren's office, and I told her everything, and she started pulling records while I sat there, and about 20 minutes in, she looked up at me over her glasses and she said, "Mr. Denning, I want to make sure you understand your own situation, because I don't think your son understands it at all. And then she explained to me what I half knew and had never had to think about. She said, "When you and your wife bought that house in 1998, you took title as joint tenants with right of survivorship. Do you know what that means?" I said I thought I did. She said, "It means that the instant your wife passed away, her share of that house did not go to her children. It went to you, automatically, by operation of law. That house is not half yours, Mr. Denning. It is entirely yours, and it has been since the moment she died. Your son didn't inherit a doorknob. The house was mine, completely." Shane had changed the locks on a house he had exactly zero legal claim to. Then Karen Lindgren pulled up the adoption record from 1994, and she looked at it for a moment, and something in her face softened, and she said, "And Mr. Denning, legally, this boy is your son, fully. The adoption is permanent and complete. He can stand on a porch and tell you you're not his real father all he wants. A judge signed a decree 30 years ago that says otherwise, and there is no undoing it." I sat in that office, and I'll be honest with you, I cried a little. Not because I'd won anything yet, because a stranger with a law degree had just told me, in the coldest, most official language there is, the thing I'd known in my heart for 30 years and had just had thrown back in my face on my own front lawn, that I was his father, that the paper said so, that it was real. But Karen wasn't finished. She said, "Now there are things we need to check, because a man who would lock you out of your own house has usually done other things too." He had. The second thing I'd done that morning was call the bank, because during Colleen's illness, when I was exhausted and terrified and not thinking straight, I'd added Shane as a signer on one of our accounts, the account we used to pay her medical bills, because he'd offered to help manage things, and for about a week I'd been grateful. That account had held about $40,000. It was empty. He'd moved every dollar of it out over the previous 6 weeks, while his mother was dying, into an account of his own. And it was worse than that, because when Karen's office started digging, they found that 3 weeks before Colleen died, someone had applied for an $80,000 home equity line of credit against the house on Ramsey Street. A loan against my house, with my signature on it, except I never signed it. I have never in my life applied for a home equity loan. Shane had forged my name to borrow $80,000 against the house he was about to try to steal, and the only reason it hadn't fully funded yet was a paperwork delay at the bank. And the last thing, the thing I almost couldn't breathe through, when Shane dumped Colleen's belongings on the lawn, some of them didn't make it back to me, and I found out why. He'd gone through her jewelry box first, and he'd taken her wedding ring and a cameo brooch that had belonged to her grandmother, and he'd pawned them at a shop on Central Avenue for $190. He sold his own mother's wedding ring for $190, 4 days after her funeral. That's the boy I raised. And I did raise him. I have gone over it 1,000 times, wondering what I did wrong, wondering if I was too soft, or not soft enough, or if there was just something in him from the start that no amount of ball games and bike rides and bedtime stories could reach. I don't have an answer. I don't think I ever will. Bridget grew up in the same house, with the same father, and Bridget drove up from Cloquet every week to hold her dying mother's hand. Same house, same dad. 2 completely different hearts. Before I tell you what I set down on the table in front of him, hit subscribe if you haven't yet. You are going to want to see his face. Now, back to it. Here's what I did, and I did it in the right order. because Karin Lindgren told me that if I did it in the wrong order, he'd run. First, we got me back into my own house, because Shane's lockout wasn't just cruel, it was illegal. You cannot lock the legal owner out of his own property. Karen made 2 phone calls, and a Duluth police officer met me at the house on Ramsey Street, and I got a locksmith to drill Shane's brand new deadbolt right back out, and I walked into my own home, and I stood in the living room where Colleen and I raised 2 kids, and I picked her mother's quilt up off the floor where the movers had dropped it, and I put it back on the couch where it belonged. Second, Karen brought everything to an investigator with the Duluth Police Department named Ruth Ojala, who handles financial crimes. And Investigator Ojala took the forged loan application and the emptied account and the pawn shop record, because a pawn shop makes you show ID, and they'd photographed Shane's driver's license when he sold his dead mother's ring. And she said, "Mr. Denning, this is forgery. This is theft by swindle, and this is financial exploitation. This is a strong case." And there was one more piece, and it's the piece that makes me love my neighbors until the day I die. Across the street from us, on Ramsey Street, lives a woman named Marge Salo, 71 years old, who has been Colleen's friend for 25 years. And when Shane was out on my lawn that day, changing the locks and dumping boxes, Marge Salo stood at her front window and filmed the whole thing on her phone, 10 minutes of it. Shane carrying out Colleen's things, Shane and Amber laughing about something, and Marge had also run out in the drizzle when they left and grabbed Colleen's photo albums and her mother's quilt off the wet grass before they were ruined, and kept them safe and dry in her own house for me. A 71-year-old widow across the street did more to protect my wife's memory in 10 minutes than my own son did in his whole life. Now I had all of it. The ownership, the adoption, the forgery, the theft, the pawn record, the video. And I let Shane keep thinking he'd won. I even let him believe, through the lawyers, that maybe I'd just quietly go away, because that's what he was counting on. That the soft old mailman who was not really his dad didn't have the fight in him. We set the meeting at Karin Lindgren's office. Shane thought it was to negotiate, to talk about his share of Mom's estate. He came in a nice jacket, with Amber, and with a young lawyer they'd hired, and he sat down across that conference table looking almost relaxed. And Karin let me talk. I slid the first document across the table, the deed, and I said, "Shane, this house was never your mother's to leave to anybody. She and I owned it together, and when she died, it became mine. All of it. When you changed those locks, you locked the legal owner out of his own home, and that's a crime." His jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything yet. I slid the second document across, and this was the one I'd waited 30 years to never have to use, and had to use anyway. The adoption decree from 1994, and I turned it around so he could read his own name on it, Shane Denning, and the judge's signature. And I said, "You told me on that porch that I'm not your real father. Read that. In the eyes of the law, son, I have been your father since you were 6 years old. That doesn't come undone because you wish it would. I am your dad. I signed for it. I meant it. I still do." Something moved across his face then, for just a second, and then it was gone, and the hard thing came back. Then I slid the rest across, the forged loan application, next to a page of my real signatures, the bank records showing $40,000 gone, and the pawn shop photograph, his own driver's license, and his mother's wedding ring in an evidence bag. And I watched my son look at a photograph of his mother's wedding ring that he had sold for $190, and I watched him understand, finally, that this was not a negotiation. His lawyer asked for a moment with his client. Colleen said there wouldn't be a moment, because investigator Ruth Ojala of the Duluth Police Department was in the next room, and she'd been waiting. If you think this old mailman did right by the family that stayed, comment the word justice below. I want to know you're out there. Shane was arrested that afternoon. He was charged with forgery, theft by swindle, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. That last one because his mother had been dying and dependent when he emptied that account. Amber was charged as well, for her part in it, though her case was smaller. Shane fought it for a while, and then the forged signature and the video, and the pawn record, and his own sister's willingness to testify made it hopeless, and he took a plea. He was sentenced to 5 years, and he's serving that time at the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Moose Lake, which is about 40 minutes down the road from the house on Ramsey Street. Restitution was ordered. I got the $80,000 loan voided, and I got Colleen's ring and her grandmother's brooch back out of that pawn shop, and they're in a drawer in my dresser now where they belong. But here's the part that I think about the most. The part with the real teeth in it. Before any of this happened, years ago, back when Colleen was healthy and Shane was just my son who lived out in Hermantown, I had a will, and that will left everything I owned, the house and the retirement account, every penny of it, split 50-50 between my 2 children, Bridget and Shane, equally, because they were both my kids, and that's what you do. Shane was going to inherit half of everything I have, the house, the savings, all of it. He didn't have to do a single thing except wait and be halfway decent to the man who raised him. Half of it was already his. Instead, he changed the locks 4 hours after his mother's funeral, and he called me Carl, and he sold her wedding ring, and he forged my name, because he couldn't wait, and he couldn't be kind, and he decided that 30 years of me being his father didn't count because it wasn't in his blood. I changed my will the week after he was sentenced. Everything I have now goes to Bridget and to her children, my grandchildren. Shane gets nothing. Not because I stopped being his father. I told you, that paper doesn't tear up, and neither does what's in my chest. But being a man's father does not mean being his fool, and a boy who would do what he did doesn't get to inherit what he tried to steal. He threw away a fortune that was already his, to grab at one that was never going to be. Bridget and her kids come to the house on Ramsey Street every Sunday now. My grandchildren run up and down the same stairs their mother ran up and down when I taught her to ride a bike out front. Colleen's quilt is on the couch. Her ring is in my drawer. The house is full again, full of the family that stayed, and I am, against everything, all right. Marge Salo comes over for coffee on Wednesdays, and I fixed the fence between our yards last summer, and I keep her walk shoveled all winter, because she saved my wife's photographs off the wet grass when my own son was throwing them away. I go see Shane sometimes, in Moose Lake, because I signed a paper 30 years ago, and because somewhere inside that angry man is the 6-year-old I taught to catch a baseball, and a father doesn't get to stop being one just because it breaks his heart. He mostly tells me it's my fault, that I should have just given him the house, that I ruined his life. He has never once said he was sorry, and I've stopped waiting for it. So if there's one thing I want you to take from all of this, it's this. Blood is not what makes a family. I know that better than any man alive, because I chose 2 children who weren't mine by blood, and I loved them with everything I had. And one of them became my whole heart, and one of them became a stranger who sold his mother's ring. The blood was the same for both of them. The difference was never the blood. It was never the blood. Family is the ones who show up, in the rain, at the hospital, every single week. That's it. That's the whole thing. My son told me I wasn't his real father, and to get off his mother's property. He was wrong twice. It was never his mother's house. It was mine, and I'd already left him half. He just couldn't wait, and he couldn't be kind. And it turned out, the only thing in this whole story that wasn't real was him. If this story got to you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And tell me honestly in the comments, is family the blood, or is it the ones who show up? I read every reply. Thank you for sitting a while with an old letter carrier from Duluth. I'll see you in the next one.